Welcome everybody to the re-recording of Getting to Impact, Module 2, Shifting Awareness and Will. This is the second module in our Getting to Impact coaching series, running from March until the end of August. So today we will be looking at Shifting Awareness and Will with Mark Cabaj. Mark, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Natasha. Hi, everyone again. Just a reminder about why we're all meeting on this series. The question we have across all of these sections or these different modules is how might we measure our local impact in reducing poverty in our community so that we can communicate our progress to stakeholders. And that big umbrella question is the organizing question for each of the individual modules. And this is important to remember because there's lots of different reasons we might want to measure impact, and we're going to be very clear about what we are trying to do and what we're not trying to do in this module. There's actually at least three purposes to measure impact. Number one, to track and communicate our progress to others. This is a basic function that we should be able to fulfill in a community change effort. That is in scope for our work. Also important in community change efforts is to use feedback for strategic learning. Are we making the progress we thought we were going to make, and how might we improve our strategy and approach? We also will have at different points in time in our work strategic choices to make. Should we sustain our work, shut it down, radically adapt it, scale it up? And that also requires information on measured impact. We are not addressing those latter two things in this module for the reasons we laid out at the very beginning of this whole project, but we know that even to get to the place where we get to ask strategic learning and strategic choice questions, we do have to be able to track and communicate progress as a foundation of all of them. So this is necessary for your work. It may be insufficient, but it's necessary for all of our work. Here's the framework we're using, and some of you have asked questions about language. Let's revisit language. We're using, there's lots of different frameworks to track complex change initiatives. All frameworks reveal certain things about the change effort and distort other things. This one seems to reveal the most and distort the least, so we're using it. It's an adapted version of the multi-level perspective framework, and what it says is, impact on poverty, reductions in citywide poverty level or reductions for specific areas or groups of people, that's an impact. But in order to get there, over time, we have to make progress on three interrelated scales of work: developing and supporting niche initiatives, cool programs, great projects and pilots, etc. Focusing concurrently on changing systems and policies that keep poverty in place. And finally, creating community awareness and will and buy-in in order to create the conditions for those kinds of changes. So outcomes are niche innovation changes, systems and policy change, and a community awareness and buy-in. Impact is the kind of results that, that people experience from those efforts. It's important to keep that in mind because we are, for this module, going to be talking about outcomes. And the outcomes we're going to be talking about today are community awareness and buy-in. Community awareness and buy-in for the entire poverty reduction effort, or community awareness and buy-in for very specific priorities that you might have in your plan. For instance, you might be working on early childhood development or living wage, etc. And you may have a lot of systems and policy change and niche initiatives ready to go, but you know part of your package is to get people to care about this, to understand it, and to believe that they can do something about it and eventually to act. So that's our focus today. So the premise of this is really simple. If we don't increase community awareness and buy-in, we won't create the conditions for niche innovations and system change. And all of you should have this kind of conversation with yourself and your small group about why this work is important for you, but you're going to end up talking about something like this in any event. So let's actually talk about different ways to focus on awareness and buy-in. And some of you might find that quite intimidating because unlike something concrete like a pilot project for building assets, awareness and buy-in involves a lot of different stakeholders, number one, and there's a lot of different techniques and tactics you might use to do that. And there's lots of questions about how you even know if you've improved awareness and buy-in. You might be able to say we're busy at it, but how have we actually changed things? Well, we're gonna do what we said we could do in the very first workshop. We're going to adopt and adapt a framework that someone has already established for that as a way to organize our thinking. And this framework is from the Center for Evaluation in Innovation. It's called the Strategy Advocacy Framework. It's meant to be around policy change, but it's very useful as well for just general community awareness and buy-in. And it's organized along two axes. The first one is the audiences, who we might want to talk to and try to influence. And we have the general public, we have key influencers within a system, and we have decision makers. It also says when we talk about changes, we've got 3 levels of change. Have we improved people's awareness of an issue? Number 1. 2, to what degree does that translate into greater will to do something about it? And number 3, how is that represented in action? Now, again, life is a bit more complex than this, but this is a way that helps us navigate sort of the complexity of this, and it seems to create a coherent picture of our task of improving community awareness and buy-in. This language here is the language used in the framework. As you're using it on the ground for your own work, you should feel free to insert more appropriate descriptions for yourself. So adapt it if you like, but you can see here that they've got pretty straightforward the descriptions of who the audiences are and what kind of changes you might see. But use this as a guide, not as a recipe. Please feel free to change. Now, one thing that we're not going to tackle a lot in this webinar, but the framework itself does. So please engage in it more deeply if you feel you want to answer these questions. We're going to talk a little bit more about awareness, and we'll be able to see action, but we know that there's a real mystery about after someone is aware of something, how does it lead to action? And some of the research on this around complex change initiatives points to at least 5 different components that contribute to the will to reduce poverty. Number 1 is you might be aware of an issue, but just being aware doesn't mean you change your opinion. So a person's opinion about poverty will play a part in whether or not they have a will to reduce it. Do they know someone who is poor and therefore and have a good understanding of why they're poor and therefore believe that we should or could do something? Or possibly they're disconnected, it's never affected them and they're aware of it, but they don't really have an opinion on it because it doesn't mean anything. Intensity, the strength of the person's opinion, salience, how important it is to people, their capacity to be able to act on it, and finally, their willingness to do something about it. So please dig more deeply on this, but we know that there is something magical in between improving people's awareness and then finally seeing that translated into some kind of action. Let's do a real quick walkthrough of this framework to make it a little less abstract and a bit more real. And to do that, we're going to return to this case study we've used in the last workshop, and that's payday lending reform in Calgary. So we're not going to retell the story, but we are saying that the community awareness buy-in, it was a key part of that payday lending reform effort. So we're just going to focus on that, not on all the systems and policy change and niche innovations that are also part of the story. So payday lending, to what degree or what was their strategy for increasing awareness and buy-in? Well, they asked 4 different questions, or at least the framework requires to ask 4 different questions. Who are the key audiences that we want to influence? What are our tactics? What are the outcomes we would like to see? And what are the indicators and methods for tracking whether there's outcomes, including this thing we surfaced in the first workshop, contribution analysis. So let's take a quick walk through here. Number 1, who are the key audiences? Well, this is the framework they offer us. Here's what actually happened in Calgary. Their public audiences were residents of International Avenue, where there was a concentration of 11 payday lenders in very close proximity, partly because it was in a neighborhood that had lower income and a higher number of people who were likely to use payday lending. The market responded. That's why there's so many payday lenders on the International Ave. Another public group was recent immigrants sending remittances to family back home, where they didn't necessarily have engagement with the current banking system, and it was just simply easier to send money home there and take out payday lending. And they knew that persons receiving social assistance were also a targeted group. Influencers were people who weren't necessarily making decisions about payday lending, but they certainly influenced the public narrative and understanding of that. So this, the group in Calgary focused on the editorial board of the Calgary Herald, which is the the city's major newspaper, a group of local influential philanthropists and poverty activists who might be concerned about poverty in general, but may not have targeted their attention to payday lending per se, more on the general interest of the topic of poverty. And finally, decision makers, they actually had three different clusters. They had policy decision makers in the city council, in the city of Calgary. They focused on the Ministry of Finance in Alberta, a group that was possibly considering at the moment changing, creating an act on predatory lending, and they focused on engaging local credit unions in Calgary. So those were their influence, their groups. Now, what were the tactics that they used? If you look at that advocacy framework, they give you a whole splattering of possible techniques and tactics here, and they describe them in the guide itself. So all of these are possible. Treat this as a list of wholesale opportunities that you get to retail to your local context. In the case of Calgary, they actually picked quite a number of them. They focused on policy analysis and research. They did a great study called The Cost of Payday Lending, and they shared that. They did demonstration programs with the local credit union to show that you could create alternatives to payday lending called cash crunch loans with credit unions. They worked with the Calgary Herald, with media advocacy. They championed with those local philanthropists, and with the city of Calgary and the government of Alberta. They did a heck of a lot of lobbying. And I don't know if they did model legislation, but we could also say they did regulatory feedback as well. Finally, on International Avenue, they created a community mobilization effort where they organized lots of different people on the ground to get really anxious about payday lending. So this is a great example of that, using multiple tactics to make this work. Let's go to the next slide here. Question number 3, what kinds of outcomes can we expect for each audience? Well, again, this is an archetypical description of outcomes for different levels of awareness for different audiences. Now, you don't have to use this one. Again, this is a guide, not a recipe, but they do give you a description of what an outcome looks like at different phases. So I like that. In the case of Calgary, here were the kind of outcomes that they achieved around awareness. They included, the local poverty reduction plan to include payday lending as one of their priorities in the plan. So that was awareness, and in fact, one might even call it an action, but they increased it enough that they say payday lending is a priority. And they got pretty broad research and positive feedback to payday lending research in all the constituencies that they engaged. So we could have actually tracked and talked to constituents that receive payday lending and see if their awareness had improved at all. They did a heck of a lot of stuff with the public around International Ave and poverty activists. The philanthropists formed the editorial, the Calgary Herald editorial board agreed to cover the issue over time. And there was a lot of philanthropists working to help lobby the province. And you'll see on the will to action, not only was the payday lending group in Calgary a key informant on city and provincial regulatory changes, but they encouraged the credit unions to offer these cash crunch loans, contributed to 2 city bylaws, and had a big influence on the provincial Alberta Act on Payday Lending Reform. Now, how might we ask the question of what indicator and methods are available to them? Well, again, the guidebook gives you lots of techniques that you could draw from, but here's some of the things that we could have done in Calgary, and I don't know that they did, but in retrospect, they could have done them. They could have used focus groups, poll booth polling, deliberative polling, and public polling to see in the general public of Calgary whether people's awareness and will to make change on this over time had changed. When they did the media analysis, or particularly the influencers, they could have actually done traditional media analysis, look at how the issue is represented in the media, look how frequently it's mentioned. And they could have also done bellwether evaluation where they discussed with people who represent different constituencies how their awareness and will has changed over time. And finally, around decision maker, there's several different techniques in there, but the one that popped up for me as interesting is policy decision maker rating scales, where you can track and understand your influence on different policymakers around the progress of a decision through the formal decision-making processes. All of those are possible. All of them in the guide are described a bit more fully. Again, you get to choose which ones you like, but there's a coherence to this that is really helpful. Now you'll notice here that in each of these we have something called contribution analysis. And we talked about that in the first module. Let's spend a little bit more time on that. So principle number 9 is to estimate contribution, where we realize that all of those changes on that matrix we saw with audiences and type of change, we contributed to them, but there might have been multiple forces or factors at play that contributed to those outcomes. So any one of those triangles, one of the changes, more than one factor contributed to them. So we have to ask, what are the other causes or factors that contributed to this? How did we add value to the change happening? And what's our relative contribution to making that happen? We could have, again, each of those changes possibly deserves this question. Now, you will see in the guidebook that we've created that there's at least 3 different ways of doing this: stakeholder estimates, general elimination methods, and counterfactual scenarios. Each of them have a slightly different set of strengths and limitations, and there's a bunch of different techniques for them. We've given you some sources here. I'm going to start with the most difficult one. The counterfactual scenarios says, what if we didn't do this? Would we still have seen the changes that we had seen? What if we didn't engage the Calgary Herald? What if we didn't try and influence the city bylaws or the payday lending reform? Would it made a difference? And you probably could get some pretty good data there. The province of Alberta probably was going to do something on predatory lending. So maybe we didn't have as much influence there as we thought. Maybe we did. But maybe the city of Calgary may not have changed those bylaws because they weren't even considering it for the payday lending commission. The other one is general elimination methods, where you actually take a look at all the factors that you think contribute to an outcomes and you whittle them down just through logic and reasoning and other research to ones that you think had the most impact, and see where your efforts weighed in on that. And finally, and firstly, actually the simple one, stakeholder estimates. We ask people who are involved to rate the relative contribution of the innovators' efforts to the final outcome. And in fact, I'm going to focus on that here because I think this is something that we might call a level 1 method, something we all could possibly do. Now, they didn't do it in this case study of payday lending, not because they were being ill-disciplined, etc. It just wasn't a big question for them at the moment, and they were doing all of this in real time. But let's actually pretend they could have used stakeholder estimates. And here's 2 examples used from Vibrant Communities from 10 years ago when we started messing around with this issue in the first iteration of the initiative. What we did is we would look at these stories, things like payday lending, and try and write up all the changes that people had happened and who contributed to what. And then we would ask stakeholders to rate each other's relative contribution to to each of the outcomes to see how important those outcomes were. And the scale we used was a 7-point scale, where we said, hey, look at this outcome, look what these innovators did, how would you rate their contribution? And 1 was the outcome would have happened without them. And 7 was the intervention was the primary reason for the outcome. And you'll note in the middle, there's a whole bunch of graduated responses here, including this messy middle. The outcome would have occurred without the intervention, but the intervention influenced the scale, quality, and impact of the outcome. Now, this is an interesting case study because a tool, because there's 2 case studies in which this was manifested really strongly. The first one was a policy change in Alberta called the Assured Income for the Severely Handicapped policy. And in that instance, a group of activists came together and did tremendous work to influence some of the content of a public policy. And when the policy was actually written up, a lot of the content used in that public policy document was actually from the words of the activist coalition. And that looked like, it suggested that they had a powerful contribution. When we did this contribution analysis with civil servants behind the scenes, they actually rated the contribution between 1.8 and 2 out of 7, which meant the contribution was minimal. Now, how could that have happened? Well, it turns out that they were intending to make this policy change anyways, number 1. Number 2, the reason they actually used the language because they wanted to give the innovators some sense of confidence and empowerment to participate in the second round of policy making. Because they enjoyed the first round so much and they wanted partners working into the future. So they gave them a nod by using their own content. So it turned out to be quite a modest contribution. However, in the case of Bethlehem Place in St. Catharines, Ontario, where the work was to a lot of people got together, a collaboration to create a housing unit for people leaving violent family situations. it turned out that there was a lot of people who played a big role. A labor union gave almost $1 million in free labor for carpentry, electricity, and plumbing. The school board did some zoning changes, or so did the city. There were philanthropists involved. And when we asked the question, to what degree did the roundtable contribute to making this happen? It turns out that everyone said they really played a powerful brokering role. They connected the dots and then tied the knots. And even though they didn't do anything directly, everyone gave the roundtable a 6.5 out of 7, a contribution that was somewhere between vital and critical. And they said, had they not brokered all these players, we would not have seen this housing unit. So there's a real simple way of getting at contribution for any of the changes you see in your awareness building effort. You have to make a choice about whether that data is important enough to you to warrant this kind of time and investment. Just so you know, there are people doing this all over the place now. There's a great evaluation of an initiative in Tanzania, which has a whole bunch of outcomes there. And when they show their outcomes, they report on them, you will see that they have in this table a description of the outcome and a rating of that outcome, where the rating itself shows the degree to which the outcome was achieved and the level of contribution to the outcome with some commentary. Now look at the right-hand side of this table. I find it excellent. They said the outcome would not have occurred without the project. CH was the name of the project. So if we were using that scale that we just discussed earlier, that would be a 7. In this case, it would be high. But they also acknowledge other contributing factors that they looked at before they made that call. You'll see the next one, the project was crucial in securing the outcome, but there was also other contributing factors. And finally, the outcomes were realized in full, and they said, again, with some confidence, this wouldn't have happened without our efforts. So take a look at that link if you want to see more. I love this as a communication vehicle. You could say, here was all the awareness building we did, and here's how we know we made, that there was change, and here was our contribution to that. So folks, that's a framework that we think we can adopt and adapt for our own use. There are other frameworks to use, number one, so don't get caught up in this one, but this one is really compelling. And number two, it's just a framework that's meant to guide you in your thinking. It's not a recipe. You still have to make your own choices, but it asks pretty good questions. Who are your key audiences? What are your tactics? What are your outcomes? And what are your indicators and methods, including contribution analysis, if you want to use it. As we close on this, as you work through that, you should remember the Foundations of Measurement workshop principles that we surfaced in Module 1. Why do you want to know this work? Clarify your purpose, accept imperfection. It's not going to be a perfect evaluation design. Don't worry about anything else except your priorities, how to evaluate progress on your priorities. And the rest of the principles are laid out for you, and we won't revisit them here today, but they are in your workbook. So zoom out when you're doing about measuring shifts in awareness and will in order to get a big understanding of how this stuff is working, and then zoom in again on these principles to make sure that you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's. By the way, the payday lending example, I want to confirm that as I went through it, I thought that they did almost all of the principles. The one that they were missing was they didn't assess the value of their efforts, just the contribution of their efforts. And read up a bit more on that, and you can decide for yourself whether they missed something big because of that. So what now? What? Big module, lots of ideas, important module, and hopefully the ideas are accessible. It's now over to you. You ask yourself these very basic questions. About your overall will, awareness and will building around poverty reduction and around specific plan priorities or key issues. Natasha, back to you.
All right, thanks very much, Mark. And so you'll note that you have the workbook for getting to Impact Module 2, Building Awareness and Will. It'll take you through the exercises to help you answer those 4 key questions. Who are your key audiences? What are your tactics? What are your outcomes? And what are the indicators and methods that you're going to use? We did put together an appendix for you for Module 2, so you can refer back to that payday lending example as you're going through your own exercises.
So thank you very much, everybody, for watching this webinar. Once you finish your Module 2 homework, do make sure that you connect with your manager of cities to debrief on what worked for you, what didn't work well, and any other questions that you have. And then we'll see you again on the next module session.